For 130 years, one American company owned the way the country remembered itself. Not Polaroid, not Fuji, not Agfa, not Konica, not Ilford, not Ansco. Kodak. A yellow paperboard box on the shelf of every drugstore in America from Bangor to San Diego, holding a roll of film that would carry a wedding, a vacation, a first birthday, a coffin, a Christmas morning into the future. George Eastman built the first camera an ordinary person could load and shoot without a chemistry degree. He sold it for $25 in 1888, dropped the price to $1 in 1900, and put a working camera into the hands of an American child for the first time in human history. His company invented Kodachrome, the color film that defined the 20th century. It controlled the aerial reconnaissance cameras that flew over Berlin in 1944 and Hanoi in 1965. It owned 90% of the United States film market in 1976 and 85% of the camera market in the same year. In December 1975, a 24-year-old electrical engineer in a back room of Kodak's Apparatus division built the first digital camera ever made. He showed it to the executives. They told him to put it in a drawer. This is the rise and fall of Eastman Kodak, the photography empire that invented digital photography in 1975. Hid it in a drawer and watch the world build 1 billion cameras without them. George Eastman was born on July 12, 1854, in the village of Waterville, New York, the third child and only son of a man who ran a small business school in Rochester. His father died when George was 8. The family fell into genteel poverty. At 14, George quit school to work as a messenger boy in a Rochester insurance office for $3 a week. He saved every dollar he could. By 1877, at 23, he was a junior bookkeeper at the Rochester Savings Bank, earning $1,400 a year and planning a vacation to Santo Domingo. A co-worker suggested he document the trip with a camera. Eastman bought a wet plate outfit, a wooden box camera the size of a microwave, a tripod, a tent for a portable darkroom, a nitrate bath, glass plates, chemistry, the whole load. He never took the trip. He took the camera apart instead. What Eastman saw in that pile of equipment was a problem. Photography in 1877 required a chemist. Wet plates had to be coated, exposed, and developed within 10 minutes in the dark by hand. A single landscape photograph required 40 pounds of gear and an hour of preparation. Eastman read a British photography journal that mentioned new gelatin dry plates being experimented with in England. He spent 2 years working night shifts at the bank and day shifts in his mother's kitchen, mixing emulsions on a coal stove. By 1879, he had a working dry plate. By 1880, he had a coating machine and a patent. In April 1880, he leased a third-floor loft on State Street in Rochester and started the Eastman Dry Plate Company. He was 25 years old. 4 years of growth followed. The dry plate sold to professional photographers across the country. Eastman hired a workforce, brought in a Rochester whipsocket manufacturer named Henry Strong as his business partner, and reincorporated as the Eastman Dry Plate and Film Company in 1884. Then in 1888, he made the decision that built the empire. Eastman believed photography should belong to everyone, not just the trade. He spent 2 years developing a camera that an untrained person could operate. The result, launched on September 4, 1888, was a small leather-covered wooden box with a fixed focus lens, a single shutter speed, and a roll of paper-backed film loaded at the factory and good for 100 exposures. He called it the Kodak. The name was a word Eastman invented. He liked the letter K, strong, firm, incisive, and assembled a 6-letter palindrome around it that meant nothing in any language and could be trademarked in every country on Earth. The camera sold for $25, which at the time was roughly $700 in today's money. When the customer finished the 100 shots, he mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. Kodak developed the negatives, printed the photographs, loaded fresh film, and sent the camera back ready to shoot. The advertising slogan ran on the side of every box and in every magazine in America. You press the button, we do the rest. 12 years later, in February 1900, Eastman released the camera that finished the job. The Brownie cost $1. It was made of jute board covered in imitation leather with a single meniscus lens and a simple rotary shutter, and it used a new 6-exposure roll film designated 119. It was named for the cartoon elves drawn by Palmer Cox that were on the cover of every children's magazine in America at the turn of the century. Kodak marketed the Brownie directly to children. By the end of 1900, more than 250,000 Brownies had been sold. By 1905, the Brownie had put a working camera into the hands of every American family that wanted one. George Eastman, the son of a widow who quit school at 14, had made photography democratic. The decades after the Brownie were a steady, vertical accumulation of empire. Kodak did not simply make cameras. Kodak made the film inside the cameras, the chemistry that developed the film, the paper the prints were printed on, the cardboard the prints were mailed in, the gelatin from the bones the emulsions were made of, and the chemicals from the silver mines the gelatin was coated with. By 1920, the company owned its own silver refineries, its own forest tracts for paper pulp, its own coal mines, its own pharmaceutical division spun off to make the organic intermediates it needed. By 1925, Kodak controlled roughly 80% of the global film market. There was no second. In 1935, Kodak released the product that would define color photography for the rest of the century. Kodachrome was a 3-layer color reversal film developed not by chemists but by 2 classical musicians. Leopold Mannes, a concert pianist, and Leopold Godowsky Jr., a violinist, were the sons of famous fathers in New York music circles who had spent their teenage years experimenting with color photography in a kitchen on West 86th Street. Kodak hired both of them in 1930, set them up in a Rochester lab with unlimited budget, and gave them 5 years. The result was a film stock that produced color slides so saturated and so stable that some originals shot in 1936 are still vivid today, 89 years later. In 1948, Kodak released Tri-X, the high-speed black and white film that became the standard tool of photojournalism for the next 40 years. Henri Cartier-Bresson shot Tri-X. Robert Capa shot Tri-X on D-Day. Eddie Adams shot Tri-X in Saigon in 1968. The Second World War turned Kodak into an arm of the United States government. Kodak built the aerial reconnaissance cameras that flew on the P-38 Lightning and the F-13 Super Fortress. Kodak processed the gun camera film from every American fighter squadron in Europe and the Pacific. Kodak ran the Photo Intelligence Laboratory at the Pentagon. After the war, when the Atomic Energy Commission needed to monitor fallout from nuclear tests, the agency simply contracted with Kodak, whose film badges were already deployed at every Kodak factory in the country to monitor radiation exposure of their own workers. In 1953, the company opened the George Eastman House Museum of Photography in his old Rochester mansion on East Avenue. In 1962, Kodak crossed $1 billion in annual revenue for the first time. The same year, the advertising agency J. Walter Thompson coined a phrase for the company's domestic print campaign that would enter the American vocabulary and stay there for the rest of the century: a Kodak moment. In 1964, the New York World's Fair opened in Flushing Meadows. The Kodak Pavilion was the largest pavilion at the fair, an undulating white concrete roof shaped like a sand dune, with the world's largest photographs, 18 by 36 feet, mounted around the perimeter, changed every 6 weeks. 5 million visitors walk through it in 2 seasons. By 1976, the year of the American bicentennial, Kodak controlled 90% of the films sold in the United States and 85% of the cameras. The company employed approximately 120,000 people worldwide and roughly 60,000 in Rochester alone. Kodak Park, the company's main manufacturing campus on the north side of the city, covered 2,300 acres and contained more than 200 buildings. Kodak ran its own fire department, its own power plant, its own internal railroad, and its own hospital. Rochester was a Kodak town the way Detroit was a Ford town and Hershey was a chocolate town. 1 in every 3 working adults in the metropolitan area drew a paycheck from the company. George Eastman did not live to see any of it. On the afternoon of March 14, 1932, in his upstairs bedroom on East Avenue, the 77-year-old founder of Eastman Kodak Company wrote a short note on a piece of company letterhead. The note read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" He signed it, set down the pen, lay back on the bed, and shot himself in the heart with a Luger pistol. He left the entire company in a trust whose stated purpose was the welfare of the city of Rochester. For another 44 years, the trust did exactly that. In December 1975, in a small laboratory in Building 4 of Kodak's Apparatus division on Lake Avenue, a young engineer was about to invent the thing that would end it. His name was Steven Sasson. He was 24 years old. He had a master's degree in electrical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and had been hired by Kodak 2 years earlier, fresh out of school, into a research group with no specific assignment. His supervisor, a man named Gareth Lloyd, walked over to his bench one morning in 1974 and asked him whether there might be any practical use for a new kind of semiconductor sensor that Fairchild had just announced. A charge-coupled device, a CCD, a chip that could convert light into an electrical signal. Sasson started building. The device he built over the next year was a rough-cut prototype the size of a toaster, weighing about 8 pounds, assembled from parts pulled out of catalogs and salvaged from other Kodak projects. A Fairchild 100 by 100 pixel CCD sensor, a lens borrowed from a Kodak movie camera, a digital to analog converter, a circuit board Sasson wired himself, a standard Memorex audio cassette recorder strapped to the side to store the image data. The whole thing produced a black and white image of 1/100th of a megapixel, took 23 seconds to capture, and required another 30 seconds to read back off the cassette and display on a modified television set across the room. In December 1975, Sasson called a lab technician named Joy Marshall into the room, pointed the prototype at her, and took the first digital photograph ever made. The image came up on the television. It was recognizably her. Marshall looked at it and said, "Needs work." Over the following months, Sasson and Lloyd presented the prototype to executive after executive inside Kodak. The reaction was almost always the same. The executives understood the engineering. They understood the implication. They asked Sasson when the image quality might match a 35mm color print. Sasson answered honestly, 15 to 20 years. The executives nodded, thanked him, and told him to put the device away. Years later, in a 2008 interview with the New York Times, Sasson summarized what he had been told. They were convinced that no one would ever want to look at their pictures on a television set. The patent application was filed in 1977 and granted in December 1978 as United States Patent 4131-19, assigned to Eastman Kodak Company. Kodak did not commercialize the technology. The company filed the patent, locked the prototype in a cabinet, and went back to selling film. For the next 15 years, Kodak treated digital imaging as a sideline. In 1991, the company released the Kodak DCS 100, the first commercially available digital single-lens reflex camera, built on a Nikon F3 body fitted with a 1.3 megapixel Kodak sensor and a tethered 10-pound hard drive carried on a shoulder strap. It sold for $13,000. It went to a handful of newspaper wire services and a few intelligence agencies. The mass market did not exist yet. Then between 1995 and 2000, the mass market arrived all at once. Sony released the Mavica, Canon released the PowerShot, Nikon released the Coolpix, Casio released the QV10, the first consumer digital camera with an LCD screen on the back, in 1995 for $900. By 1998, every Japanese camera company in the consumer market was shipping digital. By 2000, the year of the Sydney Olympics, more digital cameras were sold worldwide than film cameras for the first time in history. By 2003 in the United States, the same crossover happened domestically. Kodak responded. In 2001, the company launched the EasyShare line, a series of consumer digital cameras paired with a docking station that uploaded photos to a home printer or to a website. The EasyShare became the best-selling consumer digital camera line in the United States for a brief window in 2005. It did not save the company. The arithmetic was brutal. A roll of film generated revenue for Kodak 6 different times. At the factory, at the wholesaler, at the drugstore, at the photo lab, at the print counter, and at the reorder. A digital camera generated revenue once. Every digital camera Kodak sold cannibalized roughly 10 times its own price in lost film sales. Film unit volume in the United States peaked in 1999. By 2003, Kodak's film sales were declining by double digits per year. By 2005, the decline rate was 30% annually. Kodak Park began closing buildings. The drawer had finally been opened. The world inside it was no longer empty. On the morning of January 19, 2012, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, the lawyers for Eastman Kodak Company filed a 1,200-page Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition. The company was 132 years old. It was older than the Ford Motor Company. It was older than General Electric. It had outlived every direct competitor it had ever faced in the consumer film business. Polaroid had filed bankruptcy in 2001. Agfa had filed in 2005. Konica had merged with Minolta in 2003 and exited the consumer camera business in 2006. Only Fuji had crossed into digital intact by diversifying into cosmetics and pharmaceuticals built around the same gelatin chemistry that had once made film. Kodak had not diversified. It had hesitated. The decade leading up to the bankruptcy was a long, public bleed. In 2003, the company announced it was shifting its strategy away from film and toward digital. The same digital business Steven Sasson had handed it in 1975. The announcement came 8 years after Sony entered the market. In 2004, Kodak was removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average after 74 years on the index, replaced by the insurance company American International Group. The same year, the company laid off 15,000 employees, the first of a long series of cuts. In 2009, the company discontinued Kodachrome. The last roll of Kodachrome ever exposed was shot by photographer Steve McCurry on a trip through New York and India. The last roll commercially developed was processed at Duane's Photo, a small lab in Parsons, Kansas, the only facility in the world still running the K14 chemistry. The final roll was developed on July 14, 2010, for a Duane's employee named Dwayne Steinley. The image was a group photo of the lab's staff standing in front of the building. In 2011, the Kodak stock price fell below $1 a share for the first time in the company's history. The New York Stock Exchange notified the company it was at risk of delisting. The Chapter 11 filing came 2 months later. The bankruptcy was a creditor protection move designed to let Kodak sell its intellectual property portfolio. The patents Sasson and his successors had filed across 30 years of digital imaging research to the highest bidders. In December 2012, a consortium that included Apple, Google, Microsoft, Samsung, Amazon, Facebook, and Adobe paid Kodak $527 million for 1,100 of those patents. The drawer was finally emptied. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy on September 3, 2013, restructured as a small commercial printing and packaging company with about 8,500 employees worldwide. The consumer film business was sold off. The personalized imaging division was sold off. The document imaging division was sold off. The company that survived the bankruptcy bore the same name and the same yellow trademark, but had almost nothing else in common with the empire that had filed it. In the decade that preceded the filing, Kodak had laid off approximately 47,000 of its 60,000 Rochester employees. Rochester lost its identity. Kodak Park, the 4,300-acre manufacturing complex that had been the largest industrial site in upstate New York, was renamed Eastman Business Park in 2008 and converted into a multi-tenant industrial campus. Building after building was shut down. Some were demolished, some were leased to small chemical firms, battery startups, and solar manufacturers. Building 23, where Kodachrome had been coated for 74 years, was decommissioned in 2009 and pulled down in 2014. The internal Kodak Railroad stopped running. The Kodak Fire Department was absorbed into the city. The Kodak Tower, the 19-story Art Deco headquarters at the corner of State Street and Factory Street that had been the tallest building in Rochester since 1914, was still occupied by what remained of the company. The clock on the tower still kept time. Steven Sasson had been gone for nearly a decade by the time the bankruptcy hit. He had retired from Kodak in 2003 after 30 years with the company. In 2009, 3 years before the Chapter 11 filing, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Medal of Technology and Innovation in a ceremony in the East Room of the White House, citing him as the inventor of the digital camera. He accepted the medal in a dark suit. He no longer worked for the company he had built it inside. Somewhere in Rochester tonight, in a small ranch house on a street north of Ridgeway Avenue, a retired chemical engineer who is 79 years old goes down to the basement after dinner and opens a wooden box on a shelf beside the furnace. The man worked at Kodak Park for 38 years. He started in 1969 as a junior process engineer on the gelatin coating line for color paper. He retired in 2007 as a senior engineer on the Kodachrome production team, 3 years before the line shut down. His father had worked at Kodak before him. His daughter had worked at Kodak for 9 years before she was laid off in 2004 and moved to Charlotte. Inside the box are 9 yellow Kodak cardboard slide trays, each holding 80 35mm Kodachrome slides. The slides were shot by his wife, who died in 2018, on a family vacation to the Adirondacks in the summer of 1973. He carries one tray upstairs to the dining room window. The afternoon light is coming in low and golden. He holds a slide up to the window between his thumb and forefinger. His son, 8 years old, is standing on a dock at Lake Placid. The water behind him is a particular shade of blue that does not exist in any other film stock ever made. His wife, 31 years old, is reaching into the frame from the left, laughing, her hand on the boy's shoulder. The colors are still here. The yellow of the boy's life jacket, the green of the pines on the far shore, the red of his wife's sweater. The film stock that recorded the image stopped being manufactured in 2009. The Building 23 line that coded it was demolished in 2014. The Parsons, Kansas lab that processed the last commercial roll closed its K14 chemistry line in 2010. The Rochester laboratory that had processed this particular slide in August 1973 was shut down with the rest of the consumer photo finishing division in 2012. The colors are still here. The man holds the slide for a long time. He does not own a slide projector anymore. The last one he owned broke in 2011, and the bulb was no longer being made. He looks at the slide against the window the way his grandfather had looked at glass plate negatives 100 years earlier in the same city. Eastman Kodak Company lasted 132 years because George Eastman built it to last. The company died because the men who ran it after him could not bring themselves to kill the product that had made them rich. The factories are gone. The drugstore film counters are gone. The yellow boxes are gone from every shelf. The advertising, the slogans, the Kodak moments, the World's Fair Pavilion, the patents sold for pennies on the dollar to companies that did not exist when Sasson built his prototype, all of it has gone into the history. The pictures are still here. They are in shoeboxes in attics in Buffalo and Syracuse and Schenectady. They are in slide trays in basements in Rochester. They are in albums on coffee tables in Cleveland, in Pittsburgh, in Albany. They are being held up to windows on Sunday afternoons by sons and daughters and grandchildren of people who paid cash at a drugstore counter for a yellow box of film. The company ran out of time. The pictures did not.